it is the centenary year of what we can broadly call the left movement, but primarily the centenary year of the Communist Party of India. It was on 26 December 1925 that the Communist Party of India was formed in Kanpur. And this 100 years of the CPI is a moment for us to reflect on the left movement in India, its many achievements, sometimes, and more importantly, perhaps the intangible achievements of the left movement in India, but also its failures, the questions of its ideological rigidity that have not just cost the party or the parties associated with the left movement electorally, but left politics in India as a whole. It is also a moment for us to reflect if there is a need to re-articulate left politics in India. And to have this discussion, I have with me eminent historian Ramachandra Guha with us to discuss the politics of the left and the many questions that confront us regarding what left politics in India today means. Welcome to the Print, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sir, I want to ask you to begin with that, given that there has been a complete or near complete erasure of the Communist Party rules in different states in India, apart from Kerala, of course, we know there is no left government in the country. Can we say that a left is even left in India? Because a lot of mainstream consumers or consumers of mainstream politics would argue that this conversation perhaps is now redundant.
So, Sanya, before I answer that question, I'd like you and your viewers to have a more expansive understanding of politics. So, there is a left electoral politics and there's a left sensibility. So, what left wing thinkers from Marx and Engels onwards to Indian writers like Bhagat Singh and EMS Namboodiripad and so on, what they articulated was not just winning power, but also cultivating an ethic of dignity, of equality, of removal of caste distinctions, of emancipation of women. I mean, one of the really pioneering male feminist thinkers was Marx's colleague Friedrich Engels. So having a full cultural and creative life. Marx himself was a great admirer of Shakespeare, for example, right? Now, so I think it's important to have a broader, expansive view what it means to be a leftist. Winning power is clearly important. Exercising power, winning elections, running the state is a means for them towards an end. But even regardless of winning power, there's this broader sensibility of the left. So, in a electoral political sense, yes, the left is in crisis. Not very long ago, it was in power in Kerala, West Bengal, and Tripura. In Tripura and West Bengal, it has been out of power for a decade and is unlikely to regain power. In Kerala, it is currently in power. It's actually enjoying its second successive term in power under Chief Minister Vijayan. But there are elections coming in a few months. If the results of the local body polls are anything to go by, the government seems quite unpopular, and it's possible that the Congress will replace it. So we may be faced in a few months with a situation that we have not had for decades in Indian politics, that the left has no state government. But the sensibility of the left will and should remain.
Right. Relatedly, I want to ask you, is there then a need to divorce left politics from the parties that officially call themselves left? And is there a need to sort of free left politics from the monopoly of a few parties? Yeah.
I think there are many issues. One issue is, of course, why should you have 3 or 4 communist parties? Forget the Naxalites who are outside the democratic system. They fight with a gun. So let's leave them out. But you have the CPM, you have the CPI, you have the CPI-ML, which has influence in sections of Bihar. You have the Revolutionary Socialist Party, which is also has had MPs from Bengal and from Kerala. So I think the first thing would be, of course, for a pragmatic left to bring all these fragments together. In fact, there's a very interesting parallel with the state of the Congress Party. The Congress Party, represented by the Gandhi family, is actually only one fragment among the Congress party. Mamata Banerjee was once part of the Congress party. Jagan Mohan Reddy was once part of the Congress party. Sharad Pawar and his party were once part of the Congress party. So I think politically, of course, there would be the issue of bringing these parties together. More broadly, the question you raise is important because it's interesting that it's recent social movements, like the farmers' movement, left intellectuals were very active. They may or may not have, some of them were actually members of the CPIM. One of the most important farmers' leaders, Hanan Mullah, who played a very important role in the farmer struggle, was actually a paid up party member. Others were not. And if you look at filmmakers, independent filmmakers, writers, musicians, they are still broadly inspired by socialist and sometimes communist ideas. So I think that's the broader ecosystem. But electorally, yes, the left is in deep crisis and it needs to introspect. If it wants to retain power in Kerala, regain power in Bengal and Tripura, re-establish the presence it had at one stage in Bihar and UP where they were MPs. I mean, Subhashini Ali, who is a very fine social activist and feminist activist, was an MP from Kanpur, from the CPM. Now, 30 years ago. Now, this is inconceivable. So, yes, electorally, so there are two aspects to the renewal of the left. The renewal must take the shape of making it an effective fighting force in doing better in winning elections and hopefully running two or three state governments as it did in the past. And outside is the more cultural, movement-oriented left. This, as I said, this sensibility, this ethic of solidarity, of equality, of being against oppression, of being against discrimination, which should operate in everyday life regardless of what is happening in the elections.
Given that we'll get into some of the successes that the left government has had in Kerala and some of the very abject failures that it had in Bengal. We'll get into those things in just a bit. But the word left, and I do think that it's the BJP and RSS culture which has done something to unify all its opponents as leftists. So it has somehow managed to unify everyone in under one umbrella. But given that it's
so you're right. I mean, I'm routinely called a Marxist by RSS and BJP ideologues. I'm a social democrat. I'm a social democrat. I'm not a Marxist. But I routinely called that because I'm opposed to BJP. So anyone, you see, it's like this. But there is a parallel. Crude binary thinking, black and white thinking, is very common among hardline ideologues. If we look at the 1930s in Germany, when Hitler came to power, there were the communists and the social democrats. And the communists called the social democrats fascists. If you're not with us, you're with Hitler, right? Now the boot is on the other shoe. It's the right. In the 1930s, the left that practiced stereotyping and name calling. Today in Germany, it's the Indian right which does it. Yeah, I mean, that's, as I said, I'm sometimes abused where I'm routinely abused as a Marxist when I'm actually nothing of the kind.
Yeah. But it's a larger question given that the word left and it's used so loosely now and everyone who you don't agree with is called a lefty. So given that it has become such a pejorative, how do you think the left needs to re-articulate its politics and how fundamentally does it have to do that in order to have any role in sort of articulating the politics that's required today?
You see, I think if you look at the history of the left, the official left, there's been a disjunction between its theory and its practice. In theory, it still believes in armed revolution. Why else would it have Lenin as its icon in its party congresses? But in practice, it fights elections. So I think I mean, maybe we'll talk later about some of the more admirable features of the left at the personal level. For example, their principled ideology, the lack of communalism, and so on. But I think they need to, I think they need to move from a doctrinaire Leninist position towards a more social democratic approach. Some of them have. For example, a social democratic, a Leninist approach is capture of state power. We are running the government. and we are then directing the people what to do. A social democratic approach is working with the people, empowering the people through decentralized governance, creating opportunities, nurturing a welfare state which provides good health and education to all its people. So there has to be that kind of rethinking. There also has to be some incorporation of Indian icons. I was very interested to note yesterday that the CPM, just yesterday, issued a poster celebrating Bhagat Singh, which is very good but is long overdue, because for a very long time the CPM's official icons at their party congresses were Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. No Indian. Now, and they allowed Bhagat Singh, who was a Marxist, to be captured by the Hindu right, which is absolutely absurd. So I think belatedly, it's an interesting sign that at the top levels of the CPM, there may be some belated reawakening. I mean, Bhagat Singh is ours. He was a Marxist. He did not believe in, right-wing politics. He was also a complete secularist and an atheist. He did not believe in discriminating against minorities. So I think this is maybe a straw in the wind, but I hope it presages a much wider awakening of a self-reflective consciousness among the left, where they can move away from the rigid stereotypes and dogmatisms of the past towards a more open-minded engagement with Indian society.
Since we're discussing what the left can do in order to reimagine its politics, we need to sort of acknowledge the realities, for the lack of a better word, the realities that it will have to navigate in order to rearticulate or reimagine its politics. Now, even I was reading your essay that you recommended to me yesterday, that you wrote in 2011 in Caravan, and you mentioned that one of the strongest achievements of the communist parties in both Bengal and in Kerala was to sort of protect the societies from communal polarization.
Yes.
Now, in today's age, when this is fundamentally, one can argue, a communally polarized society, how can the left navigate this sort of landscape?
So, in the state in which it is in power, Kerala, it has navigated it quite well. Let me begin with Bengal, then I'll come to Kerala. I was a doctoral student in 1984, living in Kolkata, doing a PhD in Kolkata, when after the assassination of Indira Gandhi, innocent Sikhs were being butchered in Delhi and other towns of northern India. And Jyoti Basu, who was chief minister, said not a single Sikh would be touched. And in Calcutta, there were 500,000 Sikh men wearing turbans, and many of them taxi drivers, and not one of them was touched, right? So that ethos came partly from Jyoti Basu's communism, but it also came partly from his being a young man when Mahatma Gandhi went on fast in Calcutta in 1947 to promote Hindu-Muslim harmony. So that was the spirit. I mean, for all the mistakes Jyoti Basu made on this issue, he was not just admirable, but he was an inspiration and should be an example to all of us in India today. In Kerala, it's the only state which has large populations of Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. And in each of these three communities, there is a small but very visible fundamentalist trend. In Kerala, there are Hindu fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists. And yet, quite remarkably, successive governments, not just the left, but even the Congress-led, United Democratic Front, has managed to keep absolute social peace. So, if you go to, I go to Kerala very often nowadays. My column is translated in Malayalam, and I'm sometimes called for talks. And you can see, what you will not see in North India at a dinner. A group, there could be lawyers, or there could be professors, or there could be doctors, and they're seamlessly chatting, mixing. And if you scratch deeper, one would be a Hindu, one would be a Christian, one would be a Muslim, and I think that is what is really, so it's not a question of what the left should do in the context of communal polarization. It's a question of what the rest of India should learn from how the left has handled it. Because this is their one singular success. In West Bengal, they miserably failed on the economic front. They've made other very terrible mistakes which we may talk about, where, for example, lack of entering coalition governments, where they could have done good work. But one, I'd say, singular achievement which cannot be taken away from them is that actually, in this respect, they are more Gandhian than the Congress. The Gandhi's idea of interfaith harmony and no religion is superior to the other, they have internalized it. And so I would say, for all their economic and political failures, this is a sterling illustration of what the rest of us can learn from the left. By the rest of us, I mean those living in other states, and having other political affiliations. As I said, I'm not a Marxist, but I would like all parties. I mean, maybe too late to get the BJP. I mean, to moderate its hostility towards minorities, as you and I are speaking we are speaking in the week of Christmas. There have been attacks on churches in several states in India. There was a lynching of an innocent Muslim in Odisha yesterday, in Bihar the day before. So I say the BJP will not, it cannot internalize this lesson because they're committed to Hindu supremacy. But the other parties, whether it be the regional parties, the Congress, I think this is the left's greatest achievement. And in the year 2025, in many ways, it is a counterpoint to their many failures. Because when we began our discussion, Sania, we noted that it is unlikely to regain power in Bengal or Tripura anytime soon. We also noted it's likely to lose power in Kerala. So it'll vanish from largely vanish from the political landscape. But at the level of everyday life, I hope that the spirit of non-discrimination that both the Kerala communists and the Bengal communists embodied, that spirit of non-discrimination in a religious sense, that is something I think Indians everywhere need to internalize.
But I also, if you go through some of the recent releases, articulations of their vision statements, so to speak, of different communist parties, you see that there is a renewed emphasis on clarifying that they're not against religion, that the orthodox atheism that the left parties were associated with, they no longer stand for that. Do you think there is a need to state that loud and clear, that religion and left politics can work together?
Absolutely. And I think that was the position of Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah.
Mahatma Gandhi had these open air meetings where there were verses from the Gita, the Quran, the Parsi text, the Bible, and all read. Mahatma Gandhi had followers and friends from all religions. Mahatma Gandhi once made a remarkable statement when he was very young in 1896 in South Africa. He said, when he was 20, he said, every religion can be devilish or divine depending on what its proponents hold it to be. So devilish or divine, because religion has polarized. Religion has caused and precipitated violence, sometimes horrific violence. But religion has also inspired hope, charity, service, solidarity, brotherhood and sisterhood. You'll see that. So I think, the hardline, mocking atheistic opposition to religion, which Orthodox communists had.
In fact, they also criticized Gandhi for that, because a lot of them would call Gandhi almost like a soft king.
In some ways, they're coming closer to Gandhi's position. And of course, because while I'm opposed to all forms of religious bigotry, I do recognize that for many individuals, faith provides nourishment, solace, a sense of community. Celebrating a festival together, going to a church or mosque together. And in a multi-faith society like ours, it's a very complex negotiating, process. How do you allow the articulation of faith without one faith impinging on or dominating another? And that was, of course, Gandhi's lifelong mission. And in that sense, I'm glad that the communists are, abandoning their kind of knee-jerk hostility to religion, seeing religion as backward, superstitious, mumbo-jumbo, the kind of language that was once used. Because I think, religions can be devilish, they can be divine. And the multi-faith society, I mean, it's like, this is a separate question about where India is going, but I think the premise of the Republic, the premise of India was that in 1947 and then encoded in the Constitution of 1950 was we will not be a Hindu Pakistan. Whatever Pakistan does to its Hindu and Sikh minorities, we will assure our Muslim and Christian minorities equal rights. So that spirit has to be recovered, and I think the left is actually, in some ways, more admirable than some of the other parties.
And one of the other areas in which the left gets a lot of brickbats is, of course, left politics, where it is just assumed that being left is somehow being hostile to any idea of development. Do you
Yeah,
think there is a need for the left to
yeah.
very emphatically engage with the petty bourgeoisie, to sort of which also suffers equally or more at the hands of big crony capitalists? Do you think there's a rethinking that's
Very
needed?
much so. So, you see, the left, it's mistaken to say that the left was against development. What is more accurate is that the left thought only the state can ensure economic development.
Yeah.
You know, but of course, we have seen from the history of the Indian economy that we need innovation, we need entrepreneurs. Productivity, innovation, jobs, foreign exchange are created more effectively by entrepreneurs than by the state. So at the same time, you need a level playing field for the entrepreneurs. So you don't need crony capitalism of the kind that we have now. So which is where small and medium business enterprises need to be nurtured. Also, while business and entrepreneurship can promote economic productivity, it cannot promote environmental sustainability. So the state or civil society has to come in there. Likewise, the state may have to provide a social safety net instead, because the market is not going to give everyone access to the same school. The market, the rich people will go send their kids to a very gated public private school with all the facilities, and the working class will have to make do with bad government schools. So I think it's that balance. That is why I call myself a social democrat. I mean, I think that is where, and the left should move. I think they tried, they tried, but they were clumsy. For example, in West Bengal, they saw that their reputation as being anti-industry, as being pro-trade union was hurting them. And then, Buddhadev Bhattacharya called in these companies, but it was done in a ham-handed way, the land acquisition, and it allowed Mamta to launch that campaign. So I think Kerala, for example, would be Kerala has, it doesn't have, it should have been, Kerala, given its very high levels of education. Kerala should have been, Kochi should have been an IT center to rival Bangalore or Hyderabad.
Yeah.
But because of this kind of hostility to private capitalists, they were never able to get people in. But at the same time, Kerala has nurtured other industries that have gone under the radar. Tourism, Ayurveda, health. It has some of the best hospitals and people come. So I think, but absolutely, I think many entrepreneurs, after what happened in Bengal, because in Bengal, again, a little bit of history is needed here. In the 1960s, Kolkata was the leading industrial center in India, even more than Bombay. But from the 70s, there was a flight of capital. There was a flight of talent. There was a flight of able professionals, to begin with the violence and disturbance caused by the Naxalite movement. And afterwards, when the left front under Jyoti Basu came into power in 1977, industrialists felt that organized trade unions could blackmail them. They would say, we are shutting down the factory, and the communist bosses would, who were the communist ministers would not impede them. So that there was a flight. And many Calcutta businessmen actually came to my hometown, Bangalore, in the 70s and 80s. So they were not able to, Kerala has done slightly better, but they can do much more. I think, for example, China has done that. The great Chinese economic success is because Deng Xiaoping moved away from the Leninist Maoist dogma that the state is the engine of economic growth, and he said no, private individuals are the engine of economic growth. Give them fields to cultivate with ownership, allow them to start small factories, and but yet the state will still have a check. So when Jack Ma got too big, Xi Jinping worked to curtail him. But if the Chinese communists, who are regarded as a fraternal party of the CPM, were so open to market-led development, one would have thought that in Bengal and Kerala they would have been much more encouraging of investment and entrepreneurs and so on. But now there's a danger that we are becoming so polarized that it's a few crony capitalists who grab everything, and of course inequalities are increasing. So here is a space for the left, and the space is to, shall we say, make creative and effective use of the space. They can't go back to the Leninist dogma that we will have a violent revolution. The working class would it. No, they'd say we must develop small and medium enterprises who can generate the same kind of income while distributing wealth more fairly and also generating many more jobs, because small and medium enterprises are basically labor intensive, and in a country like ours with so many unemployed and underemployed people, that's what we need. So I think the idea that only the state can bring about economic development, which was very much part of the DNA of Marxist intellectuals, and was abandoned by Chinese Marxist intellectuals, I think the Indian Marxist intellectuals still kind of cling on to it. So they will always say, that the government should do more. Why are you closing down this public sector unit even though it's losing, money hand over fist? So I think the economic. So just as I said a little earlier, that their thinking on social and cultural issues is exemplary, particularly on the question of interfaith harmony. Their thinking on economic issues is a bit out of date.
So just in terms of what people think of the left, the burden of the Communist Party's, the CPIM rule in Bengal is much heavier for the left to deal with. Nobody talks as much about
Yes.
Kerala and its
Kerala.
achievements. If you can juxtapose the failures of the left in Bengal with the successes of the left in Kerala for our viewers.
So I think in Kerala, among the things that the left was able to do, not solely, I mean, other parties also contributed, was it played an important role in the Kerala model, which is very high levels of education, literacy, and gender and caste equality. Kerala in the early 20th century was the most caste-ridden state in India.
Yeah.
They were not just untouchables, they were unseeables. So, and it's not just the communists, they see Ramachandra Guha and his SNDP and the missionaries and the progressive Maharajas and the communists, they all created this, the ground for the assertion of caste and gender equality and very good education and health. In Bengal, none of that happened, happened. In fact, the Bengal Communist Party was essentially run by upper caste. It was very, Brahmins and castes. There was some reasonably good work in land reform, but the education sector was destroyed. India's best universities were in West Bengal, like Calcutta. The first IIT was in West Bengal. All these, they were top research institutions, law schools, medical schools, and they were all kind of finished by the left. So, and also it was in power too long. Now, I think this is a very important lesson for Democrats everywhere. If a party is in power for too long, it becomes complacent and arrogant and detached from the everyday life of the people. In Kerala, the communists knew that if they slipped a bit, the Congress would win the next election. And for most of the last 70 years, that's what's happened.
One has to also talk about the question of the ideological rigidity of the left. This is something that you talked, you sort of demonstrated very, very emphatically in that essay that we referred to earlier. But how much of the left's ideological rigidity has been responsible for its own downfall, and specifically the left's refusal in India, the communists' refusal in India to see socialists as any real representatives of the left? How grave was that mistake?
Very grave. So we've already talked about the inability to reunite these three or four fragments of the original CPI. I mean, the CPI that was founded 100 years ago, this week is split. That original CPI is split into four or five fragments. That was one failure, and they still don't talk about it. I mean, there hardly any moves towards unity. The second failure was that socialists are the closest to them in ideology. They had non-overlapping areas of influence. So that where the communists were influential, Bengal and Kerala, the socialists were not very influential. In Maharashtra, the communists were influential among the working class of Bombay, but everywhere else in the state, it was the socialists. In Bihar and UP, it was the socialists. Given that they were non-overlapping areas, one would have expected a kind of common front being built. I'm talking about the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, that period when both the communist and the socialist movements were quite active. I mean, after 1980, the stick politics. So Lalu Yadav's party and Mulayam Singh Yadav's party and Charan Singh's party and so on. But before that, in the 50s and 60s, you had a vigorous socialist movements, vigorous social movement in several major states of India, and you had a vigorous communist movement in several other states of India. So it would have been natural, some historian should investigate whether there were attempts to build bridges or whether the failure to build a common front was exclusively that of the communists or whether the socialists were also partisan and prejudiced and keeping their turf, protecting their turf. But that was one major missed opportunity. The other, Sanya, which I'd like to talk about is much more recent. It is after the elections of 2004, the general elections of 2004, when the Communist parties got close to 70 seats, but they refused to join the government. They refused to join the government, the government of Dr. Manmohan Singh, because of the Leninist ideology that you only join a coalition if you dominate. So in Kerala, the CPM says, yes, we will be in a coalition because we are the big brother, we have 100 seats, the CPM has 10 seats, the Revolutionary Socialist Party has 5 seats, the Muslim League has 10 seats. So that dogma was, the kiss of death. Let's conduct a thought experiment. Supposing, the left had joined as Manmohan Singh and Sonia Gandhi wanted them to do. They were happy because they came to power unexpectedly, only because the left gave them 60 odd seats. Right. Now, let's say they've taken areas that were considered rural development. The left is committed to land reform, education, health. Even finance or deputy minister of finance. I mean, some of people who are Sitaram Yechuri, who recently died, very able, articulate, upright, personable. Thomas Isaac, who was finance minister of Canada, inspire confidence that they are there not for their self-interest, but for the interest of the poor. Now, this is just about the time television is emerging. So let's say 4 or 5 politicians had joined the government. I mean, it would have enormously expanded left's footprint even in the Hindi belt, because people would have seen कि क्या बोल रहे हैं, क्या कर रहे हैं, what good work they're doing with Manrega or with building roads, right? You will remember during COVID, which is much later, because the social media and television was around, we were able to see what an extraordinarily capable health minister K.K. Shailaja was. She stood out among all the state health ministers. Similarly, 20 years earlier, if they had joined, but I think that was a catastrophic mistake of the left, because it would have made their best leaders visible in the Hindi heartland. They could have really presented themselves as an alternative to the casteist and communal parties of the Hindi heartland. And we know that there was a bitter debate in the CPM, and one group wanted to join and one group did not want to join. But it was a tragic and catastrophic mistake.
Right. I have to ask you that some of the intangible gains that the left movement has made, and what I'm thinking about is, I actually, before having this conversation, I watched this long lecture that Yogendra Yadav delivered on what it means to be left in India, and it was a very powerful lecture which he delivered last year in Kerala. And he said the left movement over the last 100 years has had an impact on Indian politics, which is not always very tangible, which is not very
Yes.
electoral. For example, he drew the contrast between Haryana's politics and Punjab's politics, and he said they're very different from each other because Punjab's politics has had this sort of beneath the surface influence of. Starting from the Gadar movement to the communist movement to the Naxalite movement. I want you to expand on what have been some of the most intangible influences that the left movement has had in India or Indian politics over the last 100 years.
So I'd say, the left has had an enormously creative and positive influence on the arts, whether it be music, dance, film, literature, painting. Some of our finest artists were influenced by the left movement, from M.F. Hussain right up till Vivan Sundaram and beyond, younger female artists, and so on. If you look at musicians, even the great Ravi Shankar comes out of it was played with IPTA for a time. Filmmakers, lyricists, particularly our great lyricists in the Mumbai film industry, whether it be Shailendra, Mazroo Sultanpuri, Sahir Ludhianvi, and right up to Javed Akhtar, and of course. So I think theatre, some of our most finest actors, directors were inspired by the left. As I said, they made their contributions. I would say their contributions came because they were innately gifted people. They were extremely talented as poets or artists or musicians or filmmakers, regardless of their political ideology. But the humanist orientation of the left, the commitment to justice, to equality, to ending caste and gender oppression, to the emancipation of the poor, gave their art a special energy, a special force. And that's why it lasted. In fact, all over the world, left-wing art has lasted much longer than right-wing art. That you could see that in Western artists or American artists or Spanish artists or African artists. So I think that is, you could say, the intangible contribution that of the left that goes beyond running state governments, winning elections. And I think there have been some very good books on it. I mean, I can recommend Sumangala Damodaran's book on IPTA, for example, and others too, on the progressive writers movement. People have written books. And so some of the finest literature, music, dance, films were really produced by people broadly associated with the left movement and inspired by its ideals.
Before I ask my last question, I have to play the devil's advocate a little bit because I myself was a 90s kid born in post-liberalization India,
Sure.
and so one can argue that aspirations shifted and fundamentally got altered post the 90s. Can this left, even the cultural left, speak to the post 90s, post liberalization, and now the Gen Z post social media age? Can they, how can they very practically capture this population's aspirations, which it principally would probably be against in many ways?
You're right. I mean, I really can't answer that question because, I'm a senior citizen myself, and even my children are in their 30s, so they're they're not, they're not Gen Z. But the issue you raise is also true of Gandhians, because Gandhians have a reputation for, and a not entirely unmerited reputation for, all the other admirable virtues, promoting austerity and living simply and not having possessions. Now, so it is a difficult task. So clearly, you would have to meet their economic aspirations, and you can't say don't change your phone and don't change your clothes and so on. But I think the spirit of Gandhi and of Marx at one level, for all their differences, I mean, the major differences on the question of violence and non-violence, but the spirit is one of challenging discrimination, that we are all the same biologically, whatever, whether we are man and woman, man is not superior. Brahmin and Dalit, Brahmin is not superior. Hindu and Muslim, Hindu is not superior. Right. So I think the spirit of camaraderie, solidarity, building interpersonal relations across these artificial boundaries of, religion and caste and class. That is something the young need. The young, particularly today, who are so unbelievably obsessed with their smartphones and likes on Instagram. It's all about the self, but it should be about other people, other selves too. Of course, your parents, your siblings, your relatives, your friends, and even strangers. I think this sense that all humanity is one, and we have to build bridges and find common meeting ground between people of different religions, castes, classes, genders, etc. I think that should be the message of the left. That's something, regardless of, it should not be, it should, and it should be communicated in a, you could say, a positive way. Lead a more fulfilling, a more whole life if you cultivate these kinds of friendships and relationships, rather than being austere and judgmental. Don't do this, don't do that. So but it is a tough task. But I'll say one last thing. I think the environmental crisis will call into question this today's absolute craze for consuming more and more. So when the environmental crisis becomes an environmental disaster, then people may remember the left and remember Gandhi too.
And actually, communication is something we didn't get a chance to speak about. But if you can briefly talk about that, because you mentioned that this is a generation that is so obsessed with its phone, and the phone is where the left and its messaging is very unmistakably missing. I had a very articulate sociologist yesterday talk to me about this, about how we don't have any social media of the left parties, and there is socialist media, there is also Dalit media,
Yes.
which is flourishing, but there's no media of the left as such.
I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert on the media, Sanya, but just reflecting on your question, it's not true that there isn't a left-wing media overseas. If you look at the revival of left-wing ideas among the youth, the Occupy movement, for example, in New York, the victory more recently of Zoran Mamdani, who's recognizably a creature of the left and who very visibly won his race by the adroit use of social media.
Yeah.
So so maybe the Indian left has to learn some of these techniques and methods from leftists overseas, who as I said, who have used them very effectively, particularly in America. A Bernie Sanders, or who is 80 plus, but his followers, articulate his ideas on social media very effectively. So the CPM and the CPI may want to study what those people are doing, and maybe get some younger spokespeople. I think one of the problems of the left, the communists in India, is that historically they've been a gerontocracy. They're not going to make a chief minister who's 45. You have to be 70 to become chief minister. Right? So I think that is also that is linked to the problem you identified. But look at Mamdani's victory. It's clearly absolutely been enabled by the use of social media. Yeah.
My last question, sir, before we wrap up, and I think we've already answered the question in some ways, but to put it succinctly, does India need a left today? And if so, of what kind? Which are the groups that are best placed to spearhead this left movement?
So, Sanya, absolutely it needs a left. In the essay of mine that you quoted, I referred to a very great literary critic called George Steiner, who was never a Marxist, who was opposed to Marxism, but who said after the fall of the Soviet Union, he said it leaves a black hole in the history of hope. Because, the politics of the left is about hope. It's powered by idealism. The politics of the right is about fear. It's powered by hatred and vengeance. So, though I'm not a communist, as I said, I'm a social democrat with a particular affinity also for the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi. But I do feel that if the communists are erased from the Indian electoral landscape, it will leave a black hole you could say, the Indian history of hope. Because especially outside politics, in the realm of popular culture, the left has contributed so much in enriching our humanity, our understanding, our compassion. So I cannot advise on how it can revive itself. I am not a Rajguru. I never prescribe what people should do and what parties should do. So I think I can, but clearly, India needs a left. A society that still has so many disfiguring illustrations of caste and gender discrimination, where there's so much oppression of Dalits and women 70 odd years after, 75 years after the constitution abolished caste and gender discrimination. A society where the gap between the rich and the poor is massively increasing,
Yeah.
under crony capitalism. A society in which politicians, bureaucrats, people in power exhibit so much arrogance and condescension towards the powerless. In a society that is so marked by inequality, injustice, oppression, authoritarianism, absolutely we need a left. I think perhaps whether it can be a left that become more democratic, a left that can transcend the communist socialist boundary, all these are open questions. But yes, I mean, if there was a moment when India needed the left, it is this.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for this very enriching conversation.
Thank you.